I want to get to the latest on Russia and ultimately the conflicts that have to do with this Russia Ukraine war. There's no better person to speak to, in my opinion, than speaking with Alex Gorbachev of the Voice of America's Russian service. And there was an interesting story that we're covering this week. We do want to pull this up for you here, Alex, because President Vladimir Putin granted an interview to U.S. television host Tucker Carlson on Tuesday. The Kremlin said it's going to be his first with an American journalist since before Russia's invasion of Ukraine nearly 2 years ago. A Kremlin spokesperson says that Putin agreed to the Carlson interview because the approach of the former Fox News host differed from the one-sided reporting of the Ukraine conflict by many Western news outlets. That's according to Reuters. For more on this, I just want to first talk with you about this, Alex, because I'm curious about what you're going to be looking for in this interview. It has not been released yet. We don't know what they're going to be speaking about. We have no context about that whatsoever, but I'm curious to know what you're going to be looking out for.
Well, Carlson just announced that they're going to release it tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern time, so we still have time to talk about it. I would be curious if Carlson asked Putin tough questions. Did he ask him about atrocities committed by the Russian army in Ukraine, like rapes, mutilations, killing of civilians? Did he ask him about Boris Nemtsov's murder? Because the hotel where Carlson is staying, where he recorded the video explaining why he came to Russia to interview Putin, it's located just a few steps away from the place where Russian opposition politician was murdered. So I'm wondering if they're gonna talk about such things. So we'll see about that. What is interesting from another analytical perspective, in this interview, Putin will be addressing American conservatives because they agreed to this interview in the light of upcoming election in the United States, and they want to address specifically audiences, voters of Republican Party. And they want this interview to be discussed in America. And in order to do that, I'm just purely speculating, but they may come out with something interesting, like, for example, about American journalist Evan Gershkovich, who is now being imprisoned by Putin's regime in Russia because he was doing investigative reporting about the war in Ukraine, and Putin doesn't want any investigative reporting about the war. So if Carlson asks anything about Gershkovich, maybe they will bring up something interesting, which I don't know. I don't want to say the word release, but something about him, something like this. Or what kind of message in general Putin will send to American conservatives in the light of elections, because they may discuss some things which trigger Putin for some reason, like LGBT or gender neutral bathrooms or some other topics. So that's interesting if we're going to see any of that, and what Putin will be what message Putin will be sending to American voters.
We've been watching the American media react to this week so far, but I got to ask you, how has the Russian media been covering this visit by Tucker?
Extensively, like he's treated in Russia like a rock star. I think when Michael Jackson came to Moscow in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed, I think he received pretty much the same reception. So before the interview, out of curiosity, I checked Russian state-run agencies, and they publish some story about Carlson like virtually every 10 minutes. And those are stories like he just left the hotel from the back door. He went to the restaurant. This is what he bought in a grocery store. This is what White House said about him interviewing Putin. So some of this news are like normal. Some of these stories are just ridiculous. So they cover every his every step he takes in Moscow. And latest what I saw on Telegram, that he was seen in Sheremetyevo airport.
When we talk about Putin himself, I'm curious, What would you be curious to ask Putin at this point in the war? Let's put your journalist cap on for a bit here. If you had this opportunity, what would be the questions that you would ask Putin one on one?
You know, Austin, Russian media, they even generated a list of questions journalists would like Carlson to ask Putin, for example, from Ukrainian journalist Dmitry Gardon. He wants to ask Putin, how does he sleep at night knowing that so many Ukrainians were murdered as a result of Russian invasion to Ukraine? Or Navalny, who is a Russian opposition leader, being imprisoned in Russia, he wanted to ask Putin, why did he build such a corrupt system in Russia? Because corruption makes his ruling easier, because it's easier to rule the country, which is completely corrupt. I would ask Putin personally about atrocities committed by the Russian army in Ukraine, about presidential so-called election in Russia, about journalists who were murdered in Russia, like Anna Politkovskaya, because unfortunately, it's me and my colleagues who are journalists, we cannot really report from Russia. All Russian independent journalists are exiled, so the only way to speak with Vladimir Putin is when he grants interviews to Western journalists.
How often does Putin do interviews with Western journalists? This is a rare occasion, it seems.
Yeah, you know, Austin, not too frequently, so occasionally, time to time. I checked the latest interview. It was before the war in June 2021. I believe he spoke with NBC News. So it's not like every week or every month. He just does it times to times when he wants to address the West or send some signals to the West. And also, it's interesting because he doesn't talk with, I don't recall last time when he, besides press conferences, when he talked one-on-one with Russian independent journalists, for example, or journalists who works for anti-Putin media outlet. For him, it's easier to speak with Western journalists because he can mock them, he can make laugh of their accent, emphasize some cultural differences foreign journalists are not aware of. But it will be much harder for him to talk with someone who was suffering from his regime for the last 20 years and who personally knows every step Putin took oppressing Russian journalists and Russian society.
And I'll go even a step further with the Western media question. How often is it that he does a one-on-one with an American media member?
It's hard to do an exact count. I recall his interview with Larry King. I think it was one of the first interviews. I remember a good American journalist, Trudy Rubin, back in, I believe it was 1999, asked at the press conference, who is Mr. Putin? And since then, almost 20 years left, and now I think we know the answer to the question who Mr. Putin is. But he doesn't. I think he is particularly interested in speaking with American journalists right now due to a certain reason, because of the upcoming presidential election in the United States, and that's why he picked or granted American journalist the permission to interview him.
Last thing I want to touch on before we go here, what are the biggest leads that you're following on the Russia-Ukraine war right now, whether it be on the battleground itself? I also am curious if you think that there's perhaps any relevance of the timing of this interview coming out at the same time as when we are coming up on the anniversary of the war taking place, Alex.
Anniversary of the war. Another timing is Putin's election in March. Also, presidential election in America, primaries. So timing is that's why this is important timeline in this interview. As we speak now, and I believe even when Carlson interviewed Putin, Russia was bombarding Ukraine. They intensified bombardings. Every day we report, Ukrainian media report, Russian media report on casualties. A lot of civilians are murdered as a result of this war every day. Why they intensified the bombardings now? I think it's related to a few reasons. One of them, they want to be as disruptive as possible because there are division in the US Congress. Right before the interview, senators weren't able to reach the agreement regarding military aid to Ukraine. There are divisions in Ukraine because Zelensky, there are some tensions between Zelensky and Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny, and they clearly we can see resignation of Ukrainian general in a few days, and also. Yeah, so this is important. This is very important.
The timing is interesting for sure. We do want to thank you, and hopefully we will talk with you soon. We'll be watching for the release of this interview and also, of course, for any major developments in the Ukraine-Russia war. As always, Alex Gorbachev of the Voice of America's Russian Service, we appreciate your time. Take care.
Thank you for having me, Austin.